What happened to education and why society went mad. Part 1. To understand what happened to education, and then because culture is downstream of education, you first have to understand where the ideas came from. Paulo Freire, a Brazilian philosopher who wrote his influential work Pedagogy of the Oppressed, pedagogy meaning the method and practice of teaching, sometime around 1967 in its original language, Portuguese. The importance of this text is that it is a Marxification of education. It does not bring Marx's ideas into education. It instead is a teaching method that has Marxist ways of thinking baked into it. How did it do that? He argued that education was not neutral. It either maintains the status quo or helps students resist it, claiming that traditional education was oppressive because it conditioned students to accept the world as it is rather than challenge and change it, saying that teachers, in the traditional model, deposit knowledge into students like money deposited in a bank, and implying that the only possible outcome is capitalist indoctrination, saying within the book, education is either for domestication or for freedom. Pedagogy of the oppressed. He then suggests in his theory of education that it would be beneficial to challenge the traditional model. What he puts forward as new model is foundational theory that would later become what American schools have adopted. Paulo Freire adopts Marx's framework of oppressed versus oppressors and applies it directly to education, framing students as the oppressed class and teachers, along with the traditional education system, as the oppressors. In his view, education has historically been controlled by the bourgeoisie, meaning it serves to maintain existing power structures rather than empower students. Freire argues that schools do not simply teach neutral knowledge. Instead, they function as tools of the ruling class to condition students into accepting societal hierarchies. He sees traditional education as a mechanism of oppression, reinforcing obedience, conformity, and acceptance of capitalism, much like how Marx described ideology as a tool used by the ruling class to maintain dominance. To counter this, Freire calls for a radical shift in education, where students are not just passive recipients of knowledge, but active participants in their own liberation. He proposes that rather than teachers depositing knowledge into students, what he calls the banking model of education, students should critically examine their own oppression and be encouraged to challenge the system. Here, Paulo Freire envisions students developing their consciousness to overthrow the traditional systems of society. By positioning students as an oppressed class, Freire transforms education from a process of learning into a political struggle, where the ultimate goal is not just knowledge acquisition, but the dismantling of oppressive societal structures through activism and resistance. This idea of education would go on to filter into the Brazilian education system, causing disastrous results within the country. Brazil's literacy rates stagnated despite Freire's claim that his methods would improve literacy by making education more meaningful to the oppressed. According to OECD PISA rankings, Brazilian students consistently perform among the worst in the world in math, reading, and science. A 2018 study found that 70% of Brazilian students completing high school could not fully understand what they read, a direct consequence of abandoning traditional reading instruction for politically charged discussions. In the 2018 PISA exam, which compares student performance worldwide, Brazil ranked 57th out of 77 countries in reading and 71st in math, lagging far behind nations with more traditional educational models. The reason why this decline happened are a few-fold. First, Freire's focus on critical consciousness and social justice led to an educational system that prioritized activism and ideology over foundational academic subjects. Instead of teaching students basic skills, the education system encouraged them to focus on their social status, oppression, and the political structures they lived under. This focus on political struggle and questioning authority often distracted from the practical, skill-building aspect of education that is necessary for individual advancement and societal progress. Because of this, students were left with poor literacy and numeracy skills because the curriculum was not geared toward improving these basic competencies, but instead toward fostering social change. The adoption of these ideas also encouraged students to engage in discussions that centered around their feelings of oppression, but did not equip them with the skills to analyze or solve problems beyond their immediate social contexts. As a result, students were encouraged to reflect on social issues without first acquiring the intellectual tools necessary for critical thinking and problem solving. This weakened their development of reasoning skills and left students unprepared for real-world challenges in areas like science, technology, and business. Freire argued that teachers should be facilitators of social change, not just instructors of knowledge. This led to an ideologically driven approach to teaching, where teachers were expected to lead political discussions and advocate for social justice causes, rather than focusing on their role as subject matter experts. Because of that injection of ideology into teaching, many teachers were not well equipped to teach their subjects at a high level. Instead of mastering the content they were responsible for teaching, they were trained to be political activists, which diluted the quality of education. This reduced students' exposure to rigorous academic instruction, particularly in subjects like math and science, where high levels of expertise are needed. Freire's belief in the liberation of students from oppression through education positioned schools as sites for social revolution, not merely places for academic development. This view conceptualized students as victims needing to be liberated, rather than as individuals who need to develop intellectual competence in specific disciplines. This resulted in students who became more focused on social struggle rather than on mastering skills necessary for personal success. Instead of striving for academic excellence, students were taught to focus on how the system oppressed them, without being shown how to succeed within or change that system through personal empowerment and competence. He framed education as a battle between the old existing structures and the struggle of student who was struggling to create a better world. While this politicized education in a way that fit his vision of social liberation, it also meant that students were encouraged to see everything through the lens of struggle and revolution. This prevented students from developing a broad intellectual foundation that could allow them to think beyond Marxist thought, now Freirean thought, stifling their intellectual freedom and critical thinking. Instead of helping students understand the complexities of society through various perspectives, the educational system focused narrowly on the conflict between people, which limited intellectual diversity and prevented students from being exposed to a variety of ideological viewpoints. This led to polarized thinking and discouraged well-rounded academic development. Freire's pedagogy emphasized social consciousness over practical skills. While this approach may have had some success in raising awareness of perceived societal injustices, it did not prepare students for the real-world demands of the workforce. Without the proper training in technical skills and professional competence, students were ill-equipped for the growing demands of the job market. As students became more focused on ideological education rather than marketable skills, Brazil saw a decline in employability among its youth, contributing to rising unemployment rates and a growing gap between public and private education. While the claimed intention was to empower students, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, by equipping them with the tools to understand and challenge oppression, these methods often resulted in an education system that lacked academic rigor and did not prepare students for the demands of the modern world. The focus on ideological education over practical skills, the politicization of teaching, and the shift away from traditional academic structures all contributed to an education system that failed to meet the basic needs of students, particularly in terms of literacy, numeracy, and workforce readiness. Now you can see that in Brazil, when this method of education was turned loose, that it had an end goal that was, for all intents and purposes, that of Marx's proletariat overthrowing the bourgeoisie. Only this time it was a theory hoping that enough students could be radicalized so that they would overthrow the existing societal structures, capitalism, colonialism, hierarchy, etc. Here I will end my covering of what is the beginning of the end for education systems around the world, for those that did adopt it and later versions. Like if this helped make things more clear, subscribe for the next part of this series where I will cover the changes and adoptions that Freire's ideas underwent when entering the U.S. education system. Thanks for watching.